strategy. But it's something that's easily missed because it doesn't always yield the flashy headlines that draw media attention. And that's the relationship between national security and our society's unmatched capacity for innovation. We have an all-star panel to talk about this general topic. So here's the plan. First, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in order, and they're going to give some opening remarks in order. So one introduction, one set of remarks, and so on down the line. We're going to have a little bit of moderated dialogue once we've gotten through that phase. But I want you to be thinking the whole time about the questions you'd like to ask. We want to make this as conversational as possible. So the moment I give you the signal, I hope you will literally all smush into the middle, try to grab the microphone, elbow each other out of the way. And whoever gets to the mic first will begin the Q&A. So we'll save at least 15 minutes, I hope, on the back end. So if that sounds good, we'll get underway with this plan. And Michael, I'll start with you. So Michael Kratsios is the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer and Deputy Assistant to the President at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. As the President's top technology advisor, Michael's led the development of the administration's technology and innovation policy agenda since inauguration. He's been instrumental in developing strategic plans for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, STEM education, 5G and broadband, driverless vehicles, commercial drones. Good heavens. I can't wait. Before joining the White House, he spent over 6 years in Silicon Valley, investing in and advising technology companies, and most recently was a principal at Teal Capital. So, Michael, why don't I turn it over to you for some initial remarks?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. As you mentioned, we've been spending the last 2 years really focusing on the core goal of ensuring American leadership in emerging technologies. And when I sort of came on board in the very early days of the administration, we spent a lot of time thinking about what should that priority be. And I think it was very, very obvious to us that should be kind of our top line leading agenda piece. And we have sort of the key goals of this administration have always been to promote job creation, to ensure economic growth, and to protect our homeland. And there is nothing that sort of sits at the nexus of all those major priorities more than leadership in emerging technologies. And it's incumbent of us as a nation to ensure leadership in these areas that are going to do all those things that we ultimately want to accomplish. So whether it's coordinating the research and development around those, whether it's reforming our regulatory regime to allow these technologies to succeed, this is something that we've been very laser focused on for 2 years, and I think we have a lot to show for it. So as we get through the Q&A, I can certainly expand on a lot of those, and I think I'm probably most proud of the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative that was launched just a few weeks ago with President Trump signing an executive order launching it. So there's a lot to share, and I think we're very proud of what we're able to accomplish.
Thanks. Glad you're here. Catherine Boyle is a principal on the investment team at General Catalyst, which is a sector and stage agnostic venture capital firm with $5 billion under management. Catherine co-heads General Catalyst's seed practice and invests in emerging and frontier technology, including aerospace, defense, computational biology, autonomous systems, vertical applications for AI. I can't help but noticing you don't have struggling law professor on your list. I can help you out.
We do actually have a company in the legal field.
Where's my card? Catherine also sits on the board of AirMap, which our drone enthusiasts, if there are any here, will know is the leading aerospace management platform for unmanned aircraft. And fascinatingly, she previously worked with Condoleezza Rice at Stanford and was a reporter at the Washington Post, which is very cool. Catherine.
So I figured I'd talk about a few macro factors that are changing things in Silicon Valley and how that impacts government, because I think it's important to understand what's happening there before we can understand why we're having a hard time working with DoD. So as Bobby said, we have $5 billion under management, and we're investing out of a $1.4 billion fund. 5 years ago, you never would have heard those words. But now, if you go to Silicon Valley, most likely you're going to be interacting with a $1 billion fund, which means that we have to return multiples of that number to our investors. And it makes it really difficult to invest in things that aren't going to be massive, massive companies. And it makes us also want to try to find the winners very early. So the time cycles that we have to invest that kind of capital have remained the same, but we have to find the winners earlier than ever. So that brings us to the second thing that's happened, which is if you were trying to create what we know is a unicorn, $1 billion company, you would have had maybe 3 to 5 years, maybe 5 years ago if you were trying to create that kind of company. Those companies are being created in 18 months. So compare that to the government sales cycle right now. If you're an investor in Silicon Valley and you're trying to return that kind of capital, you're going to think, how can I make that company in 18 months? And is the government going to be able to work with me on that? So I think there's a fundamental misalignment between the incentives of investors in Silicon Valley, which are to king-make earlier. Like, let's find the winners and let's just plow capital into those winners so that we can return our investments to our LPs. And the government, which does not like to king-make. The government likes to make sure that things are going to work with 90% accuracy before it moves forward, and we just don't have that kind of time. So I think part of the solution is finding a way to change the incentives in government, but also convincing investors that you can make a multi-billion-dollar company that sells to government.
Terrific, awesome. All right, Mike Brown. Mike spent most of his career in the private sector. He led 2 Fortune 500 companies, Quantum, Symantec. He's been active with small companies as a chairman, as an investor, as a CEO coach. I am going to be ready for tips when you're ready for that. 2.5 years ago, he became a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and he was researching questions for Secretary of Defense Ash Carter involving what China was up to with its investments in Silicon Valley. This led to his deeply influential report co-authored with Pavneet Singh, China's Technology Transfer Strategy, which I bet people in this room are familiar with. That report helped ensure passage of FIRMA, the Foreign Risk Review Modernization Act, which was part of the recent National Defense Authorization Act. That brought a sea change to the CFIUS process, Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. That wasn't the only mark he left on the NDAA. He also proposed a DoD investment vehicle that would focus on dual-use hardware, based on his observation that more than 90% of U.S. venture capital is focused on software these days. We'll talk more about that later. This led the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering to ask Mike to lead both that investment vehicle, which I believe is the National Security Innovation Capital Program, right, and the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, formerly known as Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, no longer an experiment. It aims to speed DoD's adoption of commercial technology while also supporting the National Security Innovation Base. As director of DIU since September, he's been in Austin often, as befits our increasing local focus on this space. Though I think what's really going on, he's from Houston, and he's trying to expand DIU's portfolio to encompass the barbecue sector. Confess.
The barbecue's not as good elsewhere, so it is good to come back to Austin. Thanks, Bobby. Defense Innovation Unit really comes out of Ash Carter's realization that there's a lot more innovation that's happening outside the military and outside the Beltway than there is inside. And if we want to have a competitive military, and let's face it, our military advantage, at least since World War II, is based on technological superiority. If we want to continue that, and we do, then we got to tap into that. So his idea behind the Defense Innovation Unit was kind of twofold. One, what can we do to accelerate that technology adoption? How can the government, in this case the Defense Department, be out where that innovation is occurring, which is why we're here in Austin. We're also in Silicon Valley and Boston. There's more innovation than that happening, but that's the budget we have is for those 3 offices today. So how can we, where that action is happening so that we can make sure there are connections there. And number 2, the government is a little bit hard to do business with, as Catherine mentioned. How can we make that easier? So we have some authorities which were first given to NASA after the Russians launched Sputnik, so we can move faster and operate at commercial terms so that we can make it a more attractive experience. So I'm not saying we're all the way there yet, we have more work to do, but that's the idea. Be where the innovation is happening, accelerate that innovation into the hands of the warfighter, and how can you do business in a way that we can become attractive to investors like Catherine and others. Great. It's the best job I've ever had.
Well, let's start in with the moderated dialogue portion of the event. And Mike, I'm going to stay with you and stay with DIU's topic. As I mentioned a moment ago, DIU was considered an experimental initiative, and then the X was dropped, so it sounds like DIU is here to stay, which we're all excited about. You were just mentioning some of the things that it is a unique capacity for DIU. I'd like to hear a little more detail about what's actually been proving to work over the past couple of years, and equally importantly, what's proven not to work.
So what's worked really well is the idea that we need to be looking outside the Pentagon to see what's happening. And DIU is organized into 5 different technology portfolios, and the reason we're organized around those is we've organized into those technology areas where much more investment is happening than would happen with military R&D, and it's happening at a faster rate. So when I say them, they're going to be, of course, no-brainers to you. Artificial intelligence, autonomy, commercial space, cyber, human systems, and medicine. So again, back to Ash Carter's original idea, this is where the majority of investment is happening outside the military. In fact, a pretty interesting statistic that I just ran across, we said in the 1960s, a third of global R&D was U.S. defense related. Okay, that's because of the space race, and we were working to miniaturize electronics at that point, and the DoD, the Defense Department, was instrumental in that. That's really the origin of modern Silicon Valley as we know it today. That comparable figure of a third is 3%. So if you think things haven't changed, that points to how important it is for us to be out working with the entrepreneurs, the investors who are investing in those technologies we just talked about, like AI and autonomy, et cetera. So what's worked well is that realization, talking to that community, and realizing that when we go out to work on a problem, we can't hand companies our requirements, which is kind of how the military has done business historically. Here you go, these are the requirements. The only person who can meet those requirements are traditional defense contractors. They have an overhead set up to handle that. So we try and go out with one sheet of paper that has a statement or a paragraph. This is the problem. What do you have that can solve us? We don't try and think we know what's happening out there or what's going to be the best solution to that problem. You tell us what you can do to help us address that. And then we have what I mentioned a minute ago. It's a boring authority called Other Transactions that allows us to move quickly. So we start with a minimum of what's the answer, you tell us the answer, then we try and move very quickly. So that's working really well. I guess to address what's not working well, we found now that we can prototype very fast. We can get a company on contract within 60 days, lightning fast for government. And then we can prototype, and then our budgeting process in Washington takes so long, it goes back to the McNamara era at the Pentagon, that we have an institutional delay that can be 12 to 18 months. So we have to work faster on that problem. How do we take a successful prototype and get that fielded quickly? So we're all about that right now and trying to work much more closely with our customer partners in DoD to get capability fielded.
Great. Well, I have a question now that's actually for all three of you, and I think Catherine, I'll ask you to weigh in first. And this has to do with something, a trend perhaps that I think we've all seen examples of, whether it's the reaction to Project Maven or the recent attempt at an employee letter at Microsoft, involving the friction that arises when technology companies do things with and for the U.S. military establishment. Is the Pentagon actually welcome Silicon Valley?
So I very much believe it is. I think when you heard the stories of Google employees walking out or people being upset with certain projects, it's a very, very small minority of people. They're a vocal minority, but it is very small. I think the frustration towards the Defense Department and towards Washington comes more from just moving fast. Like that's the big thing. And I think people will use it as an excuse. They'll say, oh, we're not going to participate on ethical grounds. They're saying that because they don't want to have to go through the hassle of working with government. So I don't actually think there's any sort of moral quandary in the minds of 99% of people in Silicon Valley. I just think that there's a question of, is this actually going to meet our economic interests? And if government's willing to kingmake, I guarantee there will be companies just knocking down the door trying to get contracts.
Before the rest of you jump in, let me ask a quick follow-up. Do you think it's equally true for the intelligence community as distinct from the Defense Department? I'm wondering about the post-Snowden hangover.
I do. I mean, I do think a lot of what is reported in the media, that there are some people who have very strong views on privacy, but I think the vast majority of engineers that I encounter just want to work on really interesting projects. Like they just want a very, very difficult thing that they want to solve. And government actually has those problems. So when you're telling engineers you get to work on the most important, most exciting, most interesting projects, I think that they're very willing to work on issues of national security and defense.
Michael, what's the view from the White House on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for us, the way I think about it a lot is we have the most amazing men and women serving in this country and around the world, protecting our most important freedoms and rights as Americans. And throughout Silicon Valley, I think there are an incredible number of engineers who want to provide the greatest technology and equipment for these folks to be able to conduct their work. And the idea of equipping our warfighters with subpar technology is not something that I think most engineers are excited about doing. I think we want those men and women in uniform to have the best possible technology in the world, and we're blessed that Silicon Valley is the place where that is actually happening. So we continue to be very excited to kind of work with and cultivate those relationships. We'll be the first to acknowledge that there is a vocal minority sometimes comes out and has some things to say on this topic. And I think it's incumbent on us as sort of elected representatives as a government to kind of engage with the entire stakeholder community. And I think there's really good examples of how the Department of Defense is reaching out to the community, hearing from them. The Defense Innovation Board, for example, is running a process now to think about artificial intelligence principles that can be used for the Defense Department. It's a very open, transparent process. There's an event actually going to be held later this month at Carnegie Mellon, and then next month at Stanford, where the community can come together with officials from the DoD and talk about some of these very tough problems as we integrate these new technologies into our processes at the DoD. So we're excited to continue that, and I can't stress enough that we want our men and women in uniform to have the best possible equipment the world has ever seen.
So Mike, you're sort of the tip of the spear, as it were, on this particular issue. You walk into an office, you get out the business card, you hand it to them, and they sort of see that it's DoD ultimately. Do you get some funny looks? Have you had some awkward encounters? What does it seem like from your perspective?
Yeah, unfortunately, no controversy here. I have to agree with everything that Catherine and Michael said. If folks know about Defense Innovation Unit, they're curious about how they can get involved, how they can work with us, and can we be faster in working on commercial terms, which we try and do. So we see this, as you mentioned, firsthand, because when we have a problem that we make public on our website and ask for, okay, what can the innovation ecosystem provide? What can individual companies who are focused in these areas, drones, AI, provide? We're seeing an increasing number of submissions to those solicitations. We get on average 20 different companies' submissions for every question or problem that we're trying to work on. And that's been increasing over the last few years. So I'd say that quantitative data says we're more welcome than ever. And I break the companies that we might work with into two categories. So one are the large multinationals, which have a lot of considerations taking place, including who might serve some of those countries like China, could be a major market. Apple's an example of that. That's a more complex decision versus most of the companies we're working with are young companies. And certainly if they're in a space like commercial space, if they're in that market, or if they're in drones, they already know when the employees that join those companies know government is going to be a big customer. So they've already gone through that decision-making process. But even those that are in AI or human systems, they're recognizing that their commercial interests align with big customers. So the economic interests are really, I think, what is dictating their interests. So we've seen tremendous enthusiasm. But we're glad to see the debate going on at other companies for the reasons that Michael said. There should be more involvement in some of these issues about what are the ethical uses of AI. And we think people can be more influential if they are part of that conversation rather than opting out.
And so I think we'll come back in a moment to the ethical questions surrounding AI. But first, Catherine, I wanted to ask you about the private sector perspective on these efforts to connect better between Washington and Silicon Valley. When you're looking at investing in a startup that has as part of its plan to target the defense establishment as part of its vertical market, what are the pros and cons that you have in mind, and what other factors as you vet that plan?
Yeah, it's interesting. It depends on what type of department you're targeting. I think I'm always looking for, when I'm trying to find companies that work with government, do they understand how government works? They understand that this is not a typical enterprise sale. Have they worked with government in the past? And one of the things when you brought up national security that came to mind that I should mention is, one of the things I always hear from engineers is like, we're used to open source software. We're used to sharing information. Like we actually, if you look at people who are developing blockchain technologies, they don't care who's on the other side. And that is not the case for what happens in Washington. You have to have clearance, what countries have you visited, are you a US citizen? All of these questions that I think are kind of antithetical to how Silicon Valley operates. And so when I'm looking at who can actually get through the process of working with government, someone who really has to understand that there's like a fundamental difference in values and even how you build software in particular that needs to change to fit government specifications. So that's something that when I'm looking at companies that are working with government, I'm constantly kind of drilling into that question. The other thing that I'm constantly looking for is like how good is the engineering team? And I do mean what I say when these are the hardest engineering challenges that we see. And so you really have to pick people that understand not only how to be great engineers, but also how to navigate a very difficult bureaucracy that doesn't look like a true enterprise sale.
I'm kind of curious, quick follow-up. When do you get to the level of vetting where you're looking at that engineering team, if it's a company that really is going to need to get those Pentagon contracts or intelligence community contracts, if they have a lot of foreign nationals on the engineering team, does it sometimes seem to you that there's a roadblock in front of them that they may not perceive?
I mean, it depends on what stage the company is at. I mean, I've definitely talked to companies at the earliest of stages that know that that's something that they have to think about. And so building the company for government from the ground up is something that we've been looking at a lot. Dual use is very important, but if you're starting a company with going after large contracts in government in mind, then it makes sense to sort of build for those specifications. But I think it's not something that everyone's thinking about.
Michael, I'm going to turn it to you and talk about broad national strategies in these areas. We often hear about China having a whole of society, not just whole of government, but whole of society commitment, because that's the sort of society they've got. They can marshal that to leap ahead of the United States and others on the value chain by seizing the commanding heights of various strategically significant technologies like quantum computing and others. And then that in turn has created a lot of anxiety here in the United States, and a lot of talk about whether the United States has an adequate national strategy of our own in the same space. OSTP is a key player in that. You are a key player in this. Recently, you guys made a big splash with the American AI strategy. I'd love to hear some about that in some detail. Like what's really important beneath the bumper stickers on that, and then what other national strategies relating to technology of a like kind might we be expecting soon?
Yeah, so I think to kind of begin, you have to look at it at the macro level of what makes the United States unique as an innovation ecosystem. And you can begin by sort of thinking a little bit about the Chinese model that you mentioned. And there it's a very centralized industrial policy driven out of Beijing. And they choose which private companies to invest money in, they choose which cities to build research labs in, and everything is controlled centrally. And that is completely different than the model we have in the United States. And I believe that the reason that the United States has been sort of a leader in global technological development and innovation over the last 50, 100 years is because of our sort of the creative ecosystem we have here, which is sort of one part academia, one part private sector, and one part federal government, all working in tandem. And this freedom to explore, to innovate, to be creative is something that ultimately I think leads to the greatest technological discovery. So as we begin to develop or have been developing these strategies over the last 2 years, that underpins our entire thinking. Our first order question is how do we turbocharge the federal government's contribution to this very dynamic, creative American technological ecosystem? So the types of questions we like to ask ourselves are, we have multiple agencies that are doing tons of research in, let's say, artificial intelligence. You have the National Science Foundation doing early stage basic research. On the other end of the spectrum, you have DARPA, DoD, that's doing very focused, more targeted AI research. And you have a bunch of stuff in between, whether it's the DOE labs working on high performance computing, or the NIH working on how you apply artificial intelligence to make medical discoveries. So for us, the role of the White House is to help coordinate those efforts. We don't want to dictate specifically what each agency should do, but we should provide coordinating mechanisms so that people are not doing duplicative work or understanding what other people are doing and can work and partner together. So that was kind of one of the first things we thought about. So with all these strategies, we generally look at three big pillars. The first is R&D. How do we do that coordination? How do we make sure that our budgets prioritize these particular technologies? And this president, the first in history to actually prioritize artificial intelligence in a budget. We're also the first administration in history to prioritize what we call the R&D priorities memo, is where the White House tells agencies this is a technology you should be looking at. And so that's one. And then the second pillar is around workforce. We understand that these technologies are going to have an impact on the way that Americans work and the way that they conduct their work over the course of their life. And I think as an administration, we understand that we're at an inflection point in workforce generally. This idea that all the skills that you need when you graduate from college are what you're going to be using for the next 50 years is totally untrue. So we continue to focus on how do we do reskilling, how do we do retraining, how do we build the right conditions and the right programs so that our workers can be trained these technologies in the future. And there's a number of programs around those. And the last pillar is usually around regulatory change. So a lot of these new technologies are what I like to call born in captivity. These are technologies that cannot be commercialized unless there's actual action by the government. So think about commercial drone operations. Commercial drones cannot fly until the FAA actually promulgates rules which allow them to. And that's just one technology. And I think we will see this as artificial intelligence begins to expand in other domains, where we as regulators can be a lot smarter and a lot faster. These technologies are going to be stuck in captivity, and our adversaries around the world are actually going to be pushing them forward. So whether it's the FDA and medical diagnostics, whether it's DOT and autonomous vehicles, we need to be pushing our regulators to be forward-looking and thinking about how we can actually commercialize those. So all of our strategies tend to follow on those three pillars. And just to kind of cap it off, I think we have really prioritized emerging tech. We've launched the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative, which happened a few weeks ago. The president signed legislation in late December, which launched the National Quantum Initiative. This is a very sort of bread and butter type of issue that the federal government focuses on. It's early stage basic research that the private sector is not incentivized to do yet, but we realize there's a critical national security priority to make sure we lead there. We've also promulgated new strategies around 5G and also around advanced manufacturing. And we'll continue to do that to make sure that we sort of have a whole of government approach that is true to the American ideals of our freedom to innovate.
So let's assume we're doing a great job and continuing to do a great job with innovation. The title of our talk is Safeguarding the Crown Jewels. And this introduces or reminds us that it's all well and good if we're innovating, but if then that innovation is being siphoned off by somebody else, well, we've done them quite a favor, and that's been quite a theme in recent years. Mike, I mentioned earlier the report that you and Pavneet wrote about Chinese investments in Silicon Valley. And so this was sort of a two-part question. It's really a question for all of you. I'm going to start with Mike and then come on down. Mike, can you kind of give us the highlights of what you guys discovered when you began looking into this topic and what consequences flowed from that? And then I'll definitely be interested, Catherine, in your reaction to how that report was received in the Valley, and especially in the investment community.
Sure. Well, the highlights of the report, again, the question from the Time Secretary Ash Carter and the Vice Chairman, the Joint Chiefs, General Sell, who has a particular interest and expertise in technology. What are the Chinese doing? What's their investment strategy? What are they investing in? How much? So we produced this report. It's publicly available on the DIUX website if you want to take a look at it. But if you want to save yourself 30 or 40 pages, here's what it says. Chinese are here investing and they're here in force. So we saw a rapid ramp from the early 2010s to 2015 is a peak year. In 2015, Chinese investors, and there's over 500 different Chinese investing entities set up to perfectly mimic Western type firms, private capital, private equity, venture capital, you name it, there's that slice there. So those 500 entities in total were investing in 16% of all venture deals done in that year in the US. 16% may not seem like a big number, but as Catherine could tell you, if you're in the investing community, you see a lot more than you invest in. So my guess is you probably see at least 3 or 4 times as many deals. Some venture capital say they see 10 times. Well, 10 times they would see every deal. I don't think that's the case. But imagine the Chinese government, through an aggregation of those 500 investors, seeing half of all US venture deals. You've got a pretty good handle on what's happening in artificial intelligence and autonomy and genetic engineering and fintech. So that is a little concerning. But then here is the real rub. US military advantages we talked about for at least the last 70, 80 years been based on technology advantage. How are you going to have a technology advantage if a potential adversary is sitting at the table learning about leading edge technology at the same time you are? It's not going to happen. So a concern about the level of investment, what was being invested in, that time advantage completely gone. And then the report further says that's only one of 10 mechanisms China is using to transfer that technology back. In fact, most people said, so what's the big deal? China's investing. The big deal isn't so much the investment, but what will China do understanding that landscape of innovation. And unfortunately, China has a different system as it relates to what's illegal activity in this country that they think is okay. We're talking about industrial espionage, cyber theft that's practiced on a scale that makes any other country's activity in that pretty much minuscule. So well organized, such a tremendous emphasis on the resources they apply to get that. Just one quick example, 250,000 Chinese Army, PLA members, sitting in Shanghai trying to unlock our secrets and then give them to companies in China. So just one example of something they're doing that's eye-opening. So you start to see, okay, they see that much of the innovation, they're practicing both legal and illegal means to get that technology back to China. That's what we mean when the crown jewels are not safeguarded. So I think there's things we can do that would be defense. I call it closing the barn door. So CFIUS reform was one of those. Export controls were passed by Congress at the same time, and the Commerce Department is very active in that right now, looking for our comments as a public on how they should think about export controls for emerging tech, whereas export controls, to simplify that, were, I'd say, primarily more backward-looking than forward-looking as it relates to emerging technologies, more focused on products than technologies themselves. And it's a complex issue on what would you want to say about emerging technology like AI. But, and this is the most important thing that for me came out of the report, while the question is really aimed at defense, the most important thing we can do, even if some of our technology is being stolen, is continue to invest in ourselves and innovate. It's the federally funded R&D that really leads to the technology breakthroughs that we're still enjoying that were done at the time of the space race, the Cold War with the Soviets, GPS, internet, miniaturized electronics, you could go on and on. We need to make sure we're making those investments today that will lead to decades of prosperity based on the technology breakthroughs we can make. So it's all about STEM education. Do we have the right policies to foster innovation? The things like Michael's working on to make sure we're developing more of a national strategy. So I couldn't be more passionate about that's what we really need to do to win this tech race we're in right now with China.
Catherine, what's the atmosphere in the Valley with respect to this idea of such high-level competition between the United States and China manifesting with pressure on Chinese investment?
Yeah, so I would love to tell you that it's top of mind for every investor and technologist in Silicon Valley that China is a threat, and that would be completely false. It is not top of mind. It's not something that people talk about or think about, unfortunately. I think if people saw the title Safeguarding the Crown Jewels, they would think that it sounds like something out of the Cold War, not where we are today. And that's a huge, huge misalignment between where Washington is and where Silicon Valley is. There's actually a great piece in the Atlantic by our mutual friend, Amy Ziegert, who had a great quote about if you talk to someone in Washington and you say the word China, they'll say the word adversary, threat, they'll be very nervous. Talk to anyone in Silicon Valley, they say customer, capital-based, supplier. It is completely misaligned in terms of how we view China. And for more proof of that, if you look at the #1 app right now, Musical.ly, it's owned by TikTok. It's a Chinese company that's collecting data. And there was actually an article in the Washington Post last week about how they're collecting data and whether that meets our standards. So I think it's not something that we're thinking about to the fullest extent. And in the same way that when a drone goes into Gatwick Airport, people get really nervous about it. I think it's going to take something that's a little bit more upfront for us to really start thinking about it as a community.
Michael, do you want to jump in with the White House perspective on any of this?
No, I totally agree with both of you. I think what we try to do is really help with the messaging. I think the report you guys put out a couple years ago, I think made a big splash, and I think motivated a lot of people on the Hill to take action. I think now that's starting to play out. I know there's been a lot of chatter around the work that Commerce is doing around the export control question. But I keep pivoting back to everything there. What we try to do so much is to try to engage the stakeholder community in solving these really tough problems. And when you're tasked with something so challenging as like establishing export controls around something as broad as artificial intelligence, It's an extraordinarily challenging problem, and it's something that we at Commerce Department cannot do alone. We have to do it through involvement with the people who know these issues best. And there's the people in Silicon Valley, the engineers who are working on these particular issues. And I think what underpins all of our efforts is that community engagement. And to the extent that we can inform them about these threats, let them know about the problems that we face as a nation once we tackle these head on, I think that's the way that we can do a better job.
So while we're on this, there's two things. One is, I agree completely that there's a big gap in how this is perceived in Washington versus Silicon Valley, Austin, other innovation hubs. But this is a generational challenge that will go beyond current politics. Because we have to think, China has very long-term plans. They've got plans in place for the next 20 or 30 years. Compare that to what we're doing in this U.S. As it relates to business community, their plans, thinking about technologies and developing. So that's one issue. But the other that's a positive that gives me hope, very much a bipartisan issue. So if you talk with Congress people on both sides of the aisle, they're very interested in trying to understand this and figure out what the U.S. response should be. And there's too few issues that are like that.
I want to pull together some of the themes I've been hearing. And Michael, part of the spur for this is you mentioned the importance of, where appropriate, deregulation earlier. And that gets me thinking about the Chinese-American competition on AI. A lot of us who have some piece of the policy part of AI are involved in lots of conversations about ethical AI. And here at UT Austin, we talk about good systems. My colleague, Dr. Peter Stone, is heavily involved in that effort. And we talk a lot about using AI and developing AI in ways that it's going to respect our values and so forth. Insofar as we are in something of an arms race with an authoritarian regime that's not going to look at it quite that same way, do the self-constraints, whether it's regulatory or just a sense of policy, ethics, and law, do the self-constraints that we are likely to embrace, and I think we should embrace, do they mean we're bound to lose this race?
I would argue we're going to win because of our values, not despite them. I think it is something that underpins the way that all of our innovators and technologists think about the work that they do. And it's because of that creativity, that freedom, those First Amendment rights, those are the things that I think will ultimately lead us to the greatest innovations. But I think what's exciting for us to think about is how can we apply American values to the development of artificial intelligence in a safe, ethical, robust, secure way. And what's challenging is, we as a community, I think, can generally come together and agree that we want artificial intelligence to be developed with those terms, it to be robust, it to be secure, it to be transparent, it to be explainable. But I think the challenge that comes up is sort of double-clicking into each of those. What does it mean to have a robust algorithm in the context of an FDA-approved medical diagnostic? What does it mean to have a secure artificial intelligence technique being used in order to do drug discovery? And I think that is where we need to have a very important and sustained dialogue between regulators and the people and technologists who know this best. And I think working together is how we can solve those problems.
And to add off that, I think one of the things that has happened since 2016 is there's definitely been a discussion in Silicon Valley around responsible innovation, how we can fix Facebook, how we can fix platforms that we really didn't foresee the problems that were going to happen. And that's everyone coming together and trying to figure out what it means to build a digital city, what kind of civilization we want to have in a digital form. And those conversations were not happening a few years ago, and now they're front and center. Every investment decision that we make, we talk about what is the impact of this company. And you'll see it in a lot of the companies that people have passed over. When you look at institutional firms, most firms passed over a company like Juul that is seen as an unethical company because it was selling cigarette substitutes to children or nicotine to children in many ways. And so when you look at that sort of thing, Silicon Valley does have an ethical moral compass, and they are thinking about what does it mean to be responsible innovators, what kind of AI do we want to have, how is it going to affect jobs in America? These are conversations that happen every day. And so I'm very, very hopeful that the value system that we have is actually going to make for better innovation and worse.
Mike, why don't I give the last question to you, and I'm going to encourage you all to begin queuing up if you're prepared to ask a question. I hope you are. We have a microphone here in the middle. Mike, the question, I want to come back to this theme of software versus hardware investment. I thought that was one of the more fascinating insights that you mentioned to me when we first met. Can you talk about what's going on there, what's driving that, and why is it problematic?
Yeah, sure. And Catherine will probably have some thoughts about what's driving it, but it surprised me living in Silicon Valley that over the last decade, the amount of investment in software has gone from 55% to 92%. This is data from the National Venture Capital Association. So even living in Silicon Valley and realizing all of the exciting IPOs are software based, I didn't have a feeling that the data was that skewed. So I think as Catherine would agree, this is because it's a lot easier to make money in software. And there's not the capital investment that's required. I don't have to worry about inventory and obsolescence from somebody who used to be in the disk drive industry. You worry about that every day. And maybe I'll create a platform that even creates outsized returns for my investment. All the tools that allow you to start a software company with less money. A lot of the trends that underlie the software industry allow you to make more money and make it faster. That's all well and good because we need a vital software industry in the U.S. Fortunately, we have one. We probably lead the world. But the military needs hardware. All that software's got to run on something. And in a world where everyone's our friend, no problem. We don't mind outsourcing that. But now the world's gotten a lot more complex recently. The National Defense Strategy calls this the era of great power competition returning, which means we have big capable adversaries, especially China. So as we've maybe not been paying attention and more of the venture capital for hardware has come from China and more of the manufacturing capacity worldwide has gone there, it becomes an issue as we think about the military and how we need to make sure we've got a secure supply chain for the future. So as it relates to batteries, printed circuit boards, of course, semiconductors, lasers, you name it. We need reliable sources of that. Doesn't mean it all needs to be manufactured in the U.S. It means we need to have a friendly supply chain that includes our allies, whether they be NATO allies or maybe an emerging ally like Vietnam or someone with a fast developing economy like India. We've got to make sure that the supply chain is secure and we've got those bases of hardware manufacturing distributed there. It's going to be critically important for our national security future.
Catherine, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, one of the trends that I think is also helpful is this incredible amount of capital that's going to Silicon Valley. It has to go somewhere, and so you actually see traditional firms that were doing software for 10 years really experimenting with hardware, semiconductors, things that they wouldn't have touched a couple years ago. And it's because there's so much more capital to deploy, but also there's a sense that we're not going to get another Facebook. We're not going to get another super capital efficient company that's has beautiful network effects where it doesn't take the kind of capital that, say, a rocket company does. And so I do think there's this sort of sentiment in Silicon Valley that we need to invest in hardware, we need to invest in deep tech, and the major firms are really putting resources there, which is leading to a different distribution of how capital is being distributed throughout the valley.
Michael, do you want to weigh in on that before we go to the Q&A?
No, good Q&A.
Okay, great. We'll go to the first question ready at the microphone.
Hi, I'm wondering how you feel in general about investing, working with bootstrapped companies, and also how you deal with the constraints they have, which is often they can't spend months developing a pilot program for relatively low money. Do you invest more in terms of paid pilot programs to help bootstrap companies compete?
So our firm actually spends a lot of time looking at bootstrap companies because we have a kind of traditional growth arm that is looking for those companies to help them scale. I'd say Silicon Valley investors have a hard time with bootstrap companies. And that's because, again, it goes back to, if we give you capital, will you be able to get the kind of talent that you need? Will you be able to just scale rapidly and kind of these smaller investment horizons? I love bootstrap companies because I think it shows that there's a product market fit there, but there is this trade-off of how fast you can grow. And so I think there's traditional pools of capital and growth capital that look for those bootstrap companies and have different return profiles that they're looking for that can build great companies off of that. But I'd say that the typical Silicon Valley investor is looking for something that's just high growth that can move a lot faster than a traditional bootstrap company.
And we're very open to working with bootstrap companies. You have to be at a stage where you got a prototype for us to work with, but that can be a great supplier for us. And when we get some funds behind the National Security Innovation Capital that Bobby mentioned, which thanks to the administration, it's in the president's budget, then we'll be able to help in an even different way at an earlier stage. So excited about that.
The president's budget, I think, dropped this morning, so I should have looked at that. Yeah. Next question, please.
Yes, David Keene from DigiDaybook. So my question is about trade and related to a couple of the themes that just came up, deregulation, hardware versus software. So even before the current trade tensions, DoD, under the mandate of Congress, had to follow a lot of rules under the Trade Agreement Act. So what are actual specific trade challenges now with Congress and that are going to affect these initiatives going forward? Because, a lot of it is legal about what you can source and what you cannot source, especially now in a world where we need to get to hardware, not just software. So, specific trade things on the horizon now that will affect this is my question.
Yeah, I think the big one that's hanging out there is the export control issue I mentioned earlier. So the NDAA, Commerce was required to look at the export control question associated with emerging technologies. They put out a list of some that include artificial intelligence, and now we're sort of going through the very substantial and sort of challenging process of trying to define what that is. So next few months you'll see a proposed rulemaking that comes out, and will give sort of the country and everyone an opportunity to take a second cut at those and help us sort of refine those, and hopefully we can get some of those straightened out by the end of the year.
Hi, I'm the founder of an early stage startup and have applied for a couple of SBIRs. So let me set that up as the lens. With that said, that's a very complicated process going for the SBIR. I am very curious the relationship that is being developed and where it is between private and government money, where an early stage startup might, based on your conversations and where you're at now, give us some guidance on where to go first.
Where to go first in terms of
getting some funding. I mean, we've built a prototype on the dining room table, and we have our algorithms developed, but we're bootstrapping, and basically we need some help in order to get this thing launched and scaled, and it is very scalable.
Yeah, I'd just say the SBIR program, as you know, is one that is ideally suited for what you're doing, but can be difficult to work with. Low amounts of money, and there are hurdles to go over if you're not familiar with how SBI works. You're very familiar, and I would love to see, and there's work going on for the Defense Department SBIRs on how do we liberalize some of that. Some of that's within our control. Other changes might need to go back to Congress because I think the venture capital industry has proven it's probably better to quickly see what are the promising ideas and give those folks more money with maybe a less bureaucratic process to get you that. So invest in the winners.
Start with private. Is what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the government programs here could learn a lot by mirroring more what the private sector has seen is successful. And then if you can get, based on an SBIR grant, if you can get private money to supplement that, I think that's the best of all worlds.
That was the original plan.
Next up.
Good morning, Captain Matt Friedel, Marine Corps. So just last Friday, I had to defend our budget. We operate a project called the Marine Maker Project, and it's to inject innovation to the lowest levels because we truly believe that those closest to the problem are those closest to the solution. In defending my budget, I had to defend it against things like tanks and boots and clothing and stuff. And so it's really hard to communicate what this innovation space is to folks and saying, oh, by the way, it's in 2.5 years. So they go, how many of these innovations are you going to buy? And I go, we can't do that. It's not an AAO sort of thing. So my question is, how do project officers like myself, in charge of establishing what our budgets and investments are going to be 18 months down the road, to senior leaders who are trying to prioritize hardware and very legacy formalized systems in the DoD? So, to you.
Well, I'll start with that. I mean, we face something similar in the Defense Innovation Unit, and really this is no different in the private sector. You got to find a sponsor, a customer, basically, who's interested in being the pull for whatever idea it is for it to work. So, same thing for us. If we have an idea, maybe based on seeing some very cool technology, that doesn't go anywhere unless you've got somebody pulling for that. So you got to find the right sponsors who can bring not only their clout, but maybe some money that helps you get that fielded. That's one of the challenges we face too.
Next question.
Yeah, Earl Barg, Austin, Texas. I'm not here to shoot the messenger, but I think the most distressing thing I heard today was that engineers just want to work on interesting projects. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of value consideration in terms of their decisions. I'd much rather hear that engineers wanted to work on our national security. So my question is for each of you, though, is would your jobs be easier, better, more fun, whatever, under an authoritarian government as opposed to supposedly...
Well, there's a question I wasn't expecting to hear.
Can I respond to your first question?
Can I just finish? As opposed to supposedly free market, and I use that word sort of loosely because if we were doing 1/3 to 3% of global R&D, that's hardly free market exactly from the textbook. I'm a political liberal. I believe in big government. I hope you want to protect me and and keep us well. So please go ahead.
So to address your first point, I think I should expand on what I was saying. I think most engineers are mission driven and they care deeply about the projects that they're working on, but they want them to be difficult problems. They don't want to get tied up in a morass of, oh, well, you can't work on this because this bureaucracy says X, or you can't do this because this is not how we do things. I think people want difficult problems that they can solve. The vast majority of engineers in Silicon Valley, I'm actually saying the opposite, they are very mission driven. They want to have impact. And they will work for less money. You see this all the time. They'll leave plum jobs at Google while they're making extraordinary amounts of money, and they'll go work on something that they care about. And that's the thing that really gets me out of bed in the morning, because that's what most engineers are excited about. I'd say, in terms of your question of whether we'd be better off under an authoritarian regime, I love this point that state-owned enterprises are actually better for innovation, because it's not true. We have something in America called capitalism, and you can align incentives much easier that way. If you just say, we'll give you a contract, and you can work on a hard problem that way. So I actually think we have a better system in terms of producing innovation. As Michael said, it's worked for many, many years, and that's why we have the innovation we have today. So I'm excited about aligning incentives through that system.
One of the great things is the national security problems tend to be some of the most interesting problems.
Absolutely.
So that complexity and the challenge really attracts people, which benefits us.
I assume you're not going to ship off to Beijing?
No, I agree with my fellow panelists. I think, as I said before, there's no greater driver of technological innovation than the free market system we have here, and I would put that up against any historical example.
Would have been quite a headline if you said the opposite.
Breaking news!
This is recording.
The bar has been set very high for these questions. This is great.
So Catherine, question for you. Really appreciate your perspective on this. So I'm Laz from the AFWorks team. I've been serving there for about a year. I'm an Air Force colonel. The question that I've seen is that from AFWorks standpoint, we like to think that we attract capital, that if the government puts a dime on some small company, that's going to be interesting to the private sector, and they're going to come over and flow more capital that way. That's our philosophy, at least. I've been counseled, if you will, by venture capitalists that when the Air Force shows up and we put a small business grant of $50,000 on something, that to the private sector, they think we're not serious because the numbers are so low when you're dealing with assets under management of $1 billion plus at your firm. So the question is what is interesting, I suppose, to the private sector when the government says that we're interested in this and that we want to help them? What's that right message? How do we signal to get private capital to flow towards that company as well?
Yeah, so I think there has to be a greater signal that you're willing to pick the winners. And so I agree with the sentiment that if you give a $50,000 grant, that's not showing that there's any sort of conviction. We use that word all the time in investing, that we have conviction around a company that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar company. So if the government even shows, it doesn't necessarily have to be through contracts immediately, but we have conviction around this company. We have conviction around this type of technology. And if you're willing to work with us, we will demonstrate that through contracts. I think that's what we need to hear more of. And that's why I'm very eager to have these dialogues, because I think it starts with discussions, it starts with dialogues. It doesn't necessarily start with $50 million contracts. We need to be moving in that direction, otherwise people get very discouraged, and unfortunately it can happen very quickly.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question?
So you talk. Is it on?
Not sure if that's a good question. Just project.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So you talked about how it's not just government and private sector, but also academia is involved. And I know that 4All Secure from the IU is founded by a university professor from Carnegie Mellon. I was wondering how you balance the needs of the universities you're engaging with the needs of the government you're engaging with as a startup, because startups like to go fast and both of those are a little bit slow.
I just say we recognize that academia is an important part of this broader concept we call national security innovation base. So one of the things that is represented as a prominent concept in the National Defense Strategy, that's a 10-page document you can Google and read about, is the fact that to take advantage of all of the elements of the innovation ecosystem, we have to reach out to all of those, and it includes investors, and it includes entrepreneurs, and it includes academia. Why? Because that's where fundamental research is happening, that's where a lot of entrepreneurs get their start. So we're just recognizing that's an important element. And I think academic institutions are healthier if they not only are contributing to the fundamental research, but if there's some flow of the great researchers into starting companies, and we get a virtuous circle there.
So I think we look at the entire chain from early basic stage fundamental research all the way to late stage commercialization applied, and academia in general sort of it sits on that one end of the spectrum that's critical. I mean, those are, especially when you look at issues like quantum computing, where the late stage commercialization work isn't happening. There's no market for it yet. So we really need to make sure that that community is engaged, and we make the very important and necessary basic research discoveries that are going to drive those industries going forward.
You know, we're going to close out real quick by pointing out that, Mike had been a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and I want to give you guys the website for that, pif.gov. But there's a lot of people in the room here who might be an interesting fit for that. And if you've enjoyed the thoughts that our panel shared with us, you can keep up with them on Twitter. Michael's at mkratsios, Catherine's at KTM Boyle, I'm at Bobby Chesney. Mike, I couldn't find one for you. DIU has one, and it's at DIU_X.
That's right.
Okay, so you
works well enough for me.
Yeah, you got X on there. So thank you all for coming out. We really appreciate the great questions, and I'm sure you'll want to come talk to our panelists. So let's thank them now.